The Great Hall of Axios Prime stretched across 3 kilometers of floating crystal platforms, and the air itself hummed with the energy of 47 species gathered in. Judgment Ambassador Chen Wei stood alone on the central platform, and she felt the weight of 8 billion human souls pressing down upon her shoulders as she faced the assembled rulers of the galaxy. Galactic Concord had governed the stars for 11,000 years, and in all that time they had never encountered a species quite like humanity. High Arbiter Vethel rose from his throne of living coral, and his bioluminescent frills pulsed with colors that translated to authority and finality across every known language. The matter before this assembly concerns the species known as humans from the planet designated Earth in the outer spiral arm, Vethel announced, and his voice carried through translator implants to every delegate present. Chen Wei kept her expression neutral even as her heart pounded against her ribs. She had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, and she had studied every diplomatic protocol and learned every gesture of respect and memorized every historical precedent that might help humanity's case. None of it would matter. The Keepers Concord had already made their decision, and this trial was nothing more than theater, designed to give legitimacy to a verdict that had been determined long before humanity ever set foot in this chamber. The evidence has been reviewed. Vethal continued, and his 4 eyes swept across the assembly with practiced gravity, and the concerns raised by the preliminary committee have been confirmed through extensive observation. A holographic display flickered to life above the central platform, and Chen Wei watched as images of human history played out for the assembled aliens to witness. They showed the wars and the weapons and the mushroom clouds rising over devastated cities. They showed soldiers marching and bombs falling, and the countless graves of those who had died in conflicts that stretched back to the very dawn of human civilization, in the span of merely 10,000 rotations around their star. Vethel said, and his voice carried notes of something that might have been pity or might have been disgust. This species has engaged in over 15,000 documented armed conflicts, resulting in the deaths of billions of their own kind. Murmurs rippled through the assembly, and delegates from peaceful species recoiled at the images, while others leaned forward with expressions that ranged from curiosity to fear. They have developed weapons capable of rendering their entire planet uninhabitable, Vethal continued, and they have come dangerously close to using these weapons on multiple occasions. The display shifted to show humanity's expansion into space, and the colony ships that had carried millions to Mars and the moons of Jupiter, and the asteroid settlements that dotted the belt like seeds scattered by a careless farmer. Despite their violent nature, the Arbiter said, "We initially considered the possibility of gradual integration into the Concord community under strict supervision and guidance." Chen Wei felt a spark of hope flicker in her chest, even though she knew it was about to be extinguished. However, Vethel said, and the word fell like a hammer, "Further analysis has revealed traits that make such integration impossible." The holographic display changed again, and this time it showed something different. It showed humans laughing and fighting, and loving and hating all within the same moments. It showed individuals making choices that defied logic and statistics and probability, showed the beautiful, terrible chaos of human nature in all its contradictory glory. Humans display an unprecedented level of individual variation in behavior and decision-making, Vethal explained, and this makes them fundamentally unpredictable on both personal and societal levels. With respect, Chen Wei said, and her voice rang clear across the chamber as she finally broke her silence. Unpredictability is not a substitute crime. The assembly fell silent, and 1,000 alien eyes turned to focus on the small human woman who dared to interrupt the High Arbiter. Frills flickered with surprise, but he gestured for her to continue. "My species is young," Chen Wei admitted, and she spread her hands in a gesture of openness. And we have made terrible mistakes throughout our history, and we carry the scars of our failures in our collective memory. She took a step forward, and her voice grew stronger with each word. But we have also shown an extraordinary capacity for growth and change and redemption. She continued, and every war has taught us the value of peace, and every atrocity has strengthened our commitment to justice. Pretty words, said a delegate from the Veshkai collective, and his translated voice dripped with contempt. But your history speaks louder than your rhetoric. Our history also includes artists and healers and dreamers. Chen Wei replied, and she turned to face her accuser directly. And it includes those who have sacrificed everything to protect strangers, and those who have devoted their lives to understanding rather than destroying. The risk is too great, Lathathov said, and his tone carried the weight of absolute certainty. And the Concord cannot allow a species with your potential for violence to move freely among the stars. Chen Wei felt the last of her hope crumble away, but she refused to let despair show on her face. "Then what is your judgment?" she asked, and her voice remained steady despite the ice spreading through her veins. Vethel rose to his full height, and his ceremonial robes cascaded around him like waterfalls of woven light. By unanimous decision of the Galactic Concord, he announced, and every word was a nail in the coffin of human ambition. The species known as humanity is hereby sentenced to permanent exile. The chamber erupted in a mixture of approval and muted sympathy, but Chen Wei heard none of it. She was focused entirely on the Arbiter as he continued to pronounce her people's fate. The Sol System and all human-occupied territories will be surrounded by interdiction beacons, effective immediately, Vithel declared, and no human vessel will be permitted to cross the boundary under penalty of destruction. For how long? Chen Wei asked, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade. Vethel paused, and something flickered in his expression that might have been regret. Permanent, he repeated. And this judgment is not subject to appeal or review. You are condemning 4 billion people to isolation, Chen Wei said, and she let the anger finally color her words. And you are doing this not for crimes we have committed, but for crimes you fear we might commit. Your species will destroy itself within 3 generations. Vethel replied, and his tone softened with what he clearly believed was kindness. And we are merely containing the damage to prevent harm to others. Chen Wei stared at the High Arbiter for a long moment, and she saw the certainty in his eyes and the absolute conviction that he was doing the right thing. She smiled, and it was a thin, cold expression that made several nearby delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You should have killed us instead," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the vast chamber. Vethelos. Frills pulsed with confusion and unease. "I do not understand your meaning," he said. Chen Wei turned and began walking toward the exit, and she did not look back as she delivered her final words to the assembly. "You will," she said, "and when you do, remember that we offered you friendship first." The doors closed behind her, and the Galactic Concord celebrated their wisdom in protecting the galaxy from the human threat. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. The interdiction beacons activated within 30 standard days of the verdict, and humanity watched as their dreams of joining the galactic community crumbled to dust. Director Amara Okonkwo stood in the command center of the United Earth Council, and she observed the final Concord escort ships departing from the edge of the solar system. "That is the last of them," her aide reported, and his voice was hollow with defeat. "And the beacon network is fully operational." Amara nodded slowly, and she felt the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden. She was now the leader of a species that had been condemned to die alone among the stars. The first few months were chaos, as expected, and riots broke out in major cities across Earth and the colonies. People demanded answers, and they demanded action, and they demanded someone to blame for the catastrophe that had befallen their species. But something strange began to happen as the initial shock faded away. The riots stopped, and the protests grew quieter, and a peculiar calm settled over human civilization like a blanket of fresh snow. General Marcus Webb noticed the change first, and he brought his observations to Director Okonkwo during a late-night strategy session. "They are not giving up," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. "And they are not surrendering to despair." "What are they doing then?" Amara asked. Webb pulled up data displays showing industrial output and research initiatives and population movements across human space. "They are preparing," he said, and a fierce pride burned in his eyes. "And they are doing it without anyone telling them to." Factories that had been producing consumer goods were retooling for shipyard operations, and universities were abandoning theoretical research in favor of applied engineering and weapons development. Old rivalries between nations did not vanish overnight, but they were set aside and filed away for a future that might never come. The message spread through human society like wildfire carried on the wind, and it was never spoken aloud, but everyone understood it perfectly. "We will not go quietly into the night." Director Okonkwo authorized the construction of Prometheus Station in the asteroid belt 3 years after the exile began, and she appointed General Webb to oversee what would become humanity's greatest secret. The station was built inside a hollowed-out asteroid, and its existence was known only to a handful of the most trusted individuals in human government. Here, the real work would begin. "We need weapons," Webb told his assembled team of scientists and engineers on the day construction was completed. "And we need ships, and we need technology that the Concord believes is impossible." Dr. Sarah Chun was the lead physicist on the project, and she had been working on theoretical energy weapons for 20 years before the exile. "The Concord's physics models have gaps," she reported, and her eyes sparkled with the excitement of discovery. "And they have accepted certain limitations as absolute laws when they are actually just engineering challenges." "Can you build something that will work?" Webb asked. Sarah smiled, and it was the same cold expression that Ambassador Chen Wei had worn in the Concord chamber years ago. "Give me time and resources," she said, "and I will build you weapons that will make the Concord wish they had simply killed us." The years passed, and the silence continued. Concord sensor sweeps occasionally scanned human space, and they recorded exactly what they expected: to find population decline and resource depletion and the slow, inevitable spiral toward extinction. What their sensors could not detect were the facilities hidden in the deep asteroid belts and beneath the frozen oceans of Europa, and in locations that existed on no official chart. The first Dreadnought-class vessel took shape in the void between Mars and Jupiter, and it was a monster of black metal and barely contained fury that measured 3 kilometers from bow to stern. Webb stood on the observation deck of Prometheus Station and watched the construction. Crews welding armor plates onto the massive frame. Admiral Yuki Tanaka joined him, and she carried a tablet displaying the latest production figures. "How many?" Webb asked. Without turning away from the view, 347 capital ships, Tanaka reported, and her voice carried notes of grim satisfaction. "And 1,200 support craft of various classes." She paused, and something changed in her expression. "And the lances," she added. The lances were Dr. Chun's masterpiece, and they were directed energy weapons capable of punching through any known armor from light seconds away. According to Concord physics, they should not exist, and according to Concord strategists, they were impossible. Humanity had built them anyway. "It is not enough," Webb said, and his voice was heavy with the knowledge of what they would eventually face. "No," Tanaka agreed, and she stood beside him in comfortable silence. "But it is a start." 15 years had passed since the exile, and humanity had transformed itself from a condemned species awaiting extinction into something the galaxy had never seen before. They had become patient, and they had become focused, and they had become dangerous in ways that defied comprehension. The children born after the exile knew nothing of the galaxy beyond the interdiction beacons, and they grew up with stories of the judgment and the sentence and the promise that one day humanity would have its answer. Webb's granddaughter was among them, and she was 12 years old when she asked him the question that every child of the exile eventually asked, "Grandfather," she said, and her eyes were bright with curiosity, "what are we going to make them pay?" Webb knelt down to meet her gaze, and he saw in her young face the determination of an entire species that refused to accept the fate others had chosen for them. Soon, he promised, and he meant every word. And when we do, the galaxy will never forget what happens when you try to cage humanity. The construction continued, and the training intensified, and the silent preparations approached their culmination. In the shadows of the outer planets, humanity built its fleet and sharpened its weapons and waited for the moment when the silence would finally end. They had been told they would destroy themselves within 3 generations, and they had been told they were too dangerous to be allowed among the stars. They would prove the Concord right about one thing: at least humanity was indeed dangerous. But they would not destroy themselves. They would show the galaxy exactly what happened when you gave humans a common enemy and a reason to unite. The 16th year of the exile approached, and with it came the end of the silence and the beginning of something the Concord could never have predicted. Humanity was ready to respond. Commander Skethra of the Rixery Scout Corps had flown reconnaissance missions for 30 standard years, and he had seen things that would make lesser beings weep with terror or wonder, but nothing had prepared him for what he found at the edge of human space. His ship emerged from hyperspace into what should have been empty void, and instead he found himself surrounded by a debris field of impossible density. Twisted metal and shattered composites floated in patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than random destruction, and Skethra felt the first stirrings of unease in his secondary heart. Navigation. He called to his crew, "And where exactly are we?" "Sector 7G, Commander." His navigator replied, and confusion colored her translated voice. "And this debris field is not on any chart." Before Skethra could order a retreat, something grabbed his ship. An electromagnetic field of staggering precision wrapped around the hull and killed their engines without damaging life support or communications. They were trapped, and they were helpless, and they were being pulled towards something hidden in the darkness between the stars. "All hands prepare for potential hostile contact," Skethra ordered, and his voice remained steady despite the fear crawling through his veins. The journey took 4 hours, and during that time, every attempt to break free or send a distress signal failed completely. Finally, the darkness parted, and Skethra saw their destination. A station hung in the shadow of the ice giant Neptune, and it was massive beyond anything the Rixery had ever constructed. Human ships surrounded it like predators circling wounded prey, and they were not the primitive vessels the Concord remembered from 16 years ago. These were warships, and they were beautiful and terrible and equal. Mashareskara and his crew were escorted from their vessel by human soldiers in armor that seemed to drink the light, and they were taken through corridors that hummed with barely contained power. Interrogation room was simple and functional, and the human woman waiting for them had not bothered to give her name. She sat across from Skethra with her hands folded on the metal table, and her eyes held the patience of someone who had all the time in the universe. "You want to know why we pulled you in?" she said, and her voice was calm and matter-of-fact. "And the answer is simple enough." Skethra tried to maintain his composure, but his secondary heart was beating too fast, and his scales had shifted to the pale color of fear. "The Concord will send ships to find me," he said, and he hated how weak his voice sounded. "The Concord thinks you experienced a navigation malfunction and crashed into an asteroid." The woman replied, and something like amusement flickered across her face. "And they will find debris consistent with that story scattered across several thousand kilometers of space. You cannot keep me here forever. We have no intention of keeping you at all," the woman said, and she leaned forward with sudden intensity. "But first you are going to answer some questions." Skethra felt his scale shift again, and this time, the color was confusion rather than fear. What questions could humans possibly want answered? He asked. "And your species has been isolated for 16 years with no access to galactic knowledge or technology." The woman smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "That is where you are wrong," she said, and she activated a holographic display that materialized above the table. Stared at the image, and his blood ran cold. It was a Nexus gate, and it was rendered in perfect technical detail down to the quantum stabilizers and the dimensional anchors. The Nexus gates were the greatest secret of the Galactic Concord, and they were the network of artificial wormholes that allowed instantaneous travel across the galaxy only. The founding species knew their locations, and only the Arbiter Council could activate new routes. "How did you obtain this?" Skethra whispered, and his voice cracked with shock. "We have been studying the gate in Sector 7G for 3 years." The woman replied, and her tone was conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. "And your patrols pass it twice a cycle without ever stopping to check for anomalies." She shook her head with what might have been disappointment. "Sloppy," she said, "and it gave us all the time we needed to map the exterior systems and decode navigation protocols." "That is impossible," Skethra said, but he knew even as he spoke that he was wrong. "The Concord told us a lot of things were impossible," the woman said, and her smile grew sharper. "And we have spent 16 years proving them wrong." She slid the holographic display closer to Skethra, and the image zoomed in on the gate's central core. "What we cannot figure out is the activation sequence," she continued, "and that is where you come in." Skethra felt his resolve harden, and he drew himself up to his full height, despite the fear still churning in his gut. "I will die before I betray the Concord," he declared. The woman studied him for a long moment, and something like respect flickered in her eyes. "No, Commander," she said softly, "and you will not die here today." She stood and walked to the door and paused with her hand on the release panel. "You are going to live," she said without turning around, "and you are going to go home and resume your duties as if nothing happened." "Why?" Skethra asked, and confusion had completely replaced his fear. "Because we already have what we need," the woman replied, and she finally turned to face him. "And your presence here was simply to confirm some final details." She smiled again, and this time there was no malice in the expression. "Also, we wanted you to see," she said, "and we wanted you to understand what is coming. And if I report this to the Concord..." The woman's smile vanished, and her eyes went cold as the void between stars. "You will not," she said, and absolute certainty filled her voice. "And if you do, we will know immediately." She leaned closer, and her whisper carried the weight of a death sentence. "We have very good hearing now, Commander," she said, "and we have ears in places you cannot imagine." Skethra was released 48 hours later, and his ship was returned to him undamaged, and his crew was unharmed. His official report listed the incident as a sensor malfunction and a minor collision with space debris. He told no one what he had really seen, and he told no one about the human fleet hiding in the shadows of their prison, but he did not sleep well for a very long time, and sometimes in the darkness of his quarters, he would wonder what the galaxy had done. When it condemned humanity to die alone, he would wonder what kind of monster they had created, and he would fear the answer. High Arbiter Vethel was attending the Festival of Concordance when the universe changed forever. The celebration marked the 11,000th anniversary of the Concord's founding, and representatives from all 47 member species had gathered on Axios Prime to honor the wisdom of their ancestors. Music filled the air and lights danced across the crystal spires, and for one perfect moment, the galaxy seemed at peace. Then every alarm in existence began to scream, not one alert and not 10 alerts, but every warning system across every sector of Concord space activated simultaneously. Bethel rushed to the command center, and his ceremonial robes tangled around his legs as he pushed through crowds of panicking delegates. "Report," he demanded as he burst through the doors, "and tell me what is happening." The tactical officer's face had gone pale with terror, and his hands trembled as he pointed at the main display, the Nexus gates. He whispered, and his voice cracked with disbelief. "And all of them are activating." Bethel stared at the screen, and his four eyes widened with horror as he watched the impossible unfold. Every Nexus gate in the galaxy was blazing to life, and this included routes that had been sealed for millennia, and gates that only the founding species knew existed. Through each portal poured ships of black metal and contained fury, and they moved with a coordination that spoke of years of preparation and planning. Humans. Bethel breathed, and the word tasted like ash in his mouth. The tactical display updated with enemy vessel counts, and the numbers climbed higher with each passing second. 300 capital ships became 500 and then 700. And still they kept coming. How is this possible? Someone shouted, and panic filled the command center like poison gas. And the humans were dying in their prison. Clearly they were not. Bethel replied, and his voice was surprisingly calm despite the chaos surrounding him. A communication request flashed across every screen in the room and every screen across Axios Prime and every screen throughout the entire Concord fleet. Admiral Yuki Tanaka's face appeared, and her expression held no anger or hatred, but only the cold focus of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "This is the United Earth Expeditionary Force," she announced, and her voice carried across every frequency in every language the Concord used. "And 20 years ago you judged us unfit to join your civilization." She paused, and the silence stretched across light years. "You called us aggressive," she continued, "and you called us unpredictable, and you called us young." Her lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "You were right," she said. The Battle of Axios Prime began 3 minutes later, and it lasted 4 hours. It was not remotely close. Concord warships were designed for peacekeeping operations against species that had forgotten how to truly fight, and they shattered like glass. Against human formations that moved with the precision of a single organism, the lances sang their terrible song across the void, and directed energy beams punched through battleship armor from distances that should have been impossible. Human fighters swarmed around Concord capital ships like angry insects, and they found every weakness and exploited every gap in defenses that had never been tested against a determined enemy. Admiral Tanaka commanded from the bridge of the UES Prometheus, and she watched the tactical display with the satisfaction of someone witnessing the culmination of 20 years of work. "Concentrate fire on their command vessels," she ordered, and her voice was steady despite the magnitude of what they were accomplishing. "And disable their communications arrays." "Admiral," her tactical officer reported, "and Concord Fleet Command is attempting to surrender." Tanaka nodded slowly, and something flickered in her eyes that might have been relief. "Cease fire on all vessels displaying surrender protocols," she commanded, "and begin recovery operations for escape pods and damaged ships." The order rippled through the human fleet, and weapons fell silent across the battlefield. Humanity had broken the Concord's military power in 4 hours, and they had done it without committing a single atrocity. They had proven they could destroy, and now they would prove something far more important. Bethel was brought before a council of human leaders 3 days after the battle, and he was escorted by soldiers who treated him with respect despite everything. The chamber was simple and functional, and it stood in stark contrast to the ornate halls of the Concord Assembly. Director Amara Okonkwo sat at the center of the human delegation, and her face was lined with decades of preparation and sacrificed General Marcus Webb sat to her right, and Admiral Tanaka to her left, and Ambassador Chen Wei occupied a position of honor despite her advanced age, High Arbiter. Director Okonkwo said, and her voice carried no hatred but only weary determination, "And we have much to discuss." Bethel straightened his spine and he met her gaze without flinching. "You have defeated us," he admitted, and the words burned like acid. "And I suppose you intend to destroy the Concord and scatter its members to the void. Is that what you would do in our position?" Chen Wei asked, and her voice was soft but sharp. Bethel considered the question honestly, and he remembered the debates that had led to humanity's exile. "Yes," he admitted, "and we would have done exactly that." Director Okonkwo nodded as if she had expected that answer. "You have a choice," she said, and she leaned forward with sudden intensity. "And the Concord can be dissolved and its species left to fend for themselves in a galaxy that will suddenly seem very large and very dark." She paused and something shifted in her expression. "Or," she continued, "or what?" Bethel asked, and hope flickered in his chest despite everything. "Or you can make room at the table," Okonkwo replied, and her words hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Bethel stared at her, and he searched her face for signs of deception or cruelty. He found neither. "You would spare us?" he asked, and confusion colored his voice. "And after everything we did to your people, we would do more than spare you," Chen Wei said, and she rose from her chair despite her age. "And we would work beside you to build something better than the Concord ever was." She walked toward Bethel, and she stopped an arm's length away. "20 years ago, I stood before your assembly and offered friendship," she said, and her eyes held memories of pain and hope intertwined. "And you responded with judgment and exile and a death sentence for my entire species." She reached out and placed her hand on Bethel's arm, and the gesture was gentle. "Despite everything, we are offering friendship again," she said, "and this time I suggest you accept." Bethel felt something break inside him, and it might have been pride, or it might have been shame. "Why?" he whispered, and the question carried the weight of 20 years of suffering. "And why? Would you show mercy to those who showed you none?" Director Okonkwo answered, and her voice filled the chamber with quiet conviction. "Because we are not who you thought we were," she said, "and we never were." She stood, and she walked to the window, and she gazed out at the stars that humanity had finally claimed as their own. "We are aggressive, yes," she admitted, "and we are unpredictable, and we are young." She turned back to face the High Arbiter, and her eyes burned with something ancient and powerful. "But we are also capable of forgiveness," she said, "and we choose to be better than our enemies expected." Bethel bowed his head, and he accepted humanity's offer. He had no other choice, but as he signed the preliminary agreements, he realized something that shook him to his core. Humanity had not offered mercy because they were weak. They had offered mercy because they were strong enough to afford it, and that terrified him more than their weapons ever could. The Treaty of Soul was signed on the exact anniversary of humanity's exile, and 47 species watched as Earth claimed its place among the stars. The document was simple and direct, and it established a new order called the Galactic Assembly. To replace the broken Concord, there would be no more exile and no more judgment, and no more species condemned to die alone in the darkness. Every world would have a voice, and every people would have a choice, and the old ways of control and fear would fade into history. Ambassador Chen Wei signed on behalf of humanity, and her hand trembled slightly with age, but her signature was clear and strong. Director Okonkwo stood beside her, and tears streamed down her face as she witnessed the moment she had spent 20 years fighting to achieve. "It is done," Chen Wei said, and her voice carried across the chamber to every delegate present. "And a new era begins today." The first year of the assembly was difficult, and old hatreds did not vanish overnight. Some species embraced the change eagerly, and the Rixari were first among them. They had chafed under Concord restrictions for centuries, and they saw in humanity a kindred spirit that understood the value of independence and self-determination. Scathra himself became the first Rixari, ambassador to Earth, and he walked the streets of cities he had once believed would crumble to dust. "You people are remarkable," he told General Webb during a diplomatic reception, "and I confess I did not believe it when I first saw your hidden fleet." Webb smiled, and the expression softened the hard lines of his face. "We had good motivation," he replied. "Other species were not so welcoming, and small insurgencies erupted across former Concord space assassination attempts. Targeted human diplomats and whisper campaigns spread rumors of human brutality and conquest. Veshkai Collective initially resisted integration, and they remembered too well how the old Concord had pacified their homeworld 3,000 years ago then. Human ships arrived bearing gifts that brought tears to ancient eyes. Cultural artifacts long thought destroyed had been recovered from Concord. Archives and human researchers had spent years restoring them to their original condition. Songs that had not been sung for millennia echoed once again through Veshkai halls, and dances that had been forgotten were performed under alien stars. "Why?" the Veshkai elder asked, and her voice cracked with emotion. "And why would you do this for us?" The human ambassador smiled, and her answer was simple. "Because someone should have done it long ago," she said, "and because your history deserves to live." The Veshkai became humanity's most devoted allies. From that day forward, years passed, and humanity proved itself in ways the old Concord never anticipated. Human doctors developed treatments for plagues that had ravaged worlds for centuries, and diseases that had been accepted as inevitable were cured. Within a generation, human engineers built Nexus gates where none had existed before. An isolated species felt the warmth of galactic community for the first time in their history. Human teachers established schools on worlds that had never known education, and children who would have lived and died in ignorance learned to read and write and dream. But humanity's greatest contribution came from an unexpected source. Sensors at the edge of known space detected movement in the void, and ancient machines awakened from dormancy that predated even the founding of the Concord. The harvesters had no name that any living species could pronounce, and they had no purpose except consumption, and they had no mercy for them. Civilizations that stood in their path, worlds burned, and fleets were scattered like leaves before a storm, and the Galactic Assembly trembled before a threat that made the Concord's old conflicts seem trivial. Humanity did not tremble. Admiral Tanaka led the combined fleet against the Harvester. Vanguard and human ships formed the tip of the spear that drove into the heart of the machine swarm. They fought, and they bled, and they died in numbers that would have broken lesser species, but they did not stop, and they did not retreat, and they did not yield. The Battle of the Outer Rim lasted 17 days, and when it ended, the Harvesters had been broken. Human casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and memorial walls on Earth and Mars, and a dozen colony worlds bore the names of those who had given everything. But the galaxy was safe, and every species in the assembly knew who had saved them. General Marcus Webb retired after the Harvester War, and he returned to Earth to spend his remaining years in peace. He built a small house in Montana, and he watched the stars from his porch every night. His great-granddaughter visited him often, and she was 23 years old and brilliant and brave and everything he had hoped she would become. "I have been accepted to the Galactic Academy on Axios Prime," she told him one evening, and her eyes sparkled with excitement. "And I will be the first human to study xenobiology alongside species that once voted for our extinction." Webb felt pride swell in his chest, and he pulled her into an embrace. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said. "Grandfather?" she asked as she settled into the chair beside him. "And do you think we did the right thing by showing mercy?" Webb considered the question carefully, and he thought about all the years of preparation and all the battles fought and all the lives lost. "I think he said slowly. "And I think that we proved something important." "What?" "That strength is not measured by how much you can destroy," he replied, and his voice grew soft with conviction. "And true strength is measured by what you choose to build." His great-granddaughter nodded, and she understood above them. Human ships crossed the sky, and they were not fleeing and they were not fighting. They were exploring and discovering and reaching for horizons that no one had ever seen 50 years after the exile. Humanity had become something new and something wonderful, and something that even their ancestors could not have imagined. They had been condemned to die alone in the darkness, and they had responded by lighting a fire that illuminated the entire galaxy. They had been called aggressive, and they had channeled that aggression into protecting the innocent. They had been called unpredictable, and they had surprised everyone by choosing compassion over vengeance. They had been called young, and they had proven that youth was not a weakness, but a strength. The stars belonged to everyone now, and humanity had earned its place among them not through conquest, but through sacrifice and service and an unwavering refusal to become the monsters others had feared. General Webb watched his great-granddaughter's shuttle rise into the evening sky, and he smiled as it disappeared among the stars. Was it worth it? His wife asked as she settled into the chair beside him. Webb thought about the silent years and the sacrifices and the friends he had buried, and the world he had helped build from the ashes of exile. "Ask me in 1,000 years," he said, but they both knew the answer already. Humanity had faced the judgment of the galaxy, and they had responded without hesitation, not with anger, and not with hatred, and not with the destruction everyone had expected. They had responded with determination and courage and an unshakable belief that they could be better than anyone thought possible. And in the end, that had made all the difference. Stars were waiting, and humanity was ready. This was only the beginning.